You're listening to Making the Cut, the mostly true life story of a retired surgeon from 1C Productions.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Seitz, founder and president of 1C Productions. This episode contains explicit language and adult content. It is intended for mature audiences only.
Looking back now, I can see how eagerly I shuffled myself beneath the wings of mentors. Perhaps I still needed the parental figure after all. Doctors Goody and Stern, both neurologists, filled the role in different ways.
Through the luck of the draw, I started on the neurology firm. For 6 weeks, I'd clerk for the brilliant, young Dr. Stern, along with a couple of my classmates. We would all then switch to the more senior and seasoned Dr. Goody. Dr. Stern reflected changing demographics, where students were not solely from prestigious public schools, but from proletarian families and grammar school backgrounds. He spoke my language. His piercing neurological insight, his dignity, and his invincible reserve captured the essence of a man in a time of social transition. I saw cases with Dr. Stern in his clinic, watching him closely. The patients suffered with epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, nerve palsies. A high number had global deterioration in their intellectual function without specific memory loss, which we called senile dementia. Among them were dietary-related dementias from alcohol, named Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, dietary deficiency of vitamin B1 or hypothyroidism, and dementia from the third stage of syphilis. I listened as the patients told us of their social settings, how they and their families coped with personal adversity. As His Eminence grew beyond UCH, Dr. Stern was referred more patients with diagnostic dilemmas. One case involved a 37-year-old violinist in the London Philharmonic who complained of headaches. When he hit the highest note, the 8C harmonic register, bowed on the uppermost rafter of his violin during Paganini's Fantasy for G-string, the note vibrated and was not clean. Dr. Stern's eyes lit up. He immediately knew there was a lesion. He described to us as likely a tumor, and where was anatomically located in the brain. Testing proved him out. The patient did, indeed, have a low-grade midline chiasmal glial growth, with an excellent prognosis once removed. When the patient resumed his virtuoso performances, he heard and played the note with absolute clarity. When not in clinic with Dr. Stern, I was assigned to clerk his ward patients. Of the numerous London medical schools, only UCH students were encouraged to write our clerking notes directly into the patient's chart. I dutifully inscribed the comprehensive medical history, the results of my examinations, and comments on laboratory tests or x-rays before concluding with my differential diagnosis and treatment plan. I signed my name clearly with great professional satisfaction, and then printed medical student. I eagerly anticipated Dr. Stern's critique in much the same fashion as I'd awaited my father's approval, time and again throughout childhood. Though I routinely looked for them, however, no marginal marks could be found in my notes. Surely my work wasn't so perfect as to merit no corrections or comments. Was anyone actually paying attention to my work? To me? Annoyed, I scribbled, piss, 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 shit, 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 fuck, 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 in the middle of my notes, then waited for admonition. none came. Like my father, Dr. Stern was excellent at his work, but not in building relationships with underlings. After 3 weeks, we switched from Dr. Stern to Dr. Goody, who instantly seemed worldlier with a broader knowledge in literature and history of neurological diseases. Halfway through the 3-month rotation, Dr. Goody invited me to attend Thursday's Clinical Pathological Conference at London's premier neurological establishment, the Institute of Neurology in Queen Square. We drove the few blocks from University Hospital in his Rover sedan. On our drive, he gave me a detailed discourse on the merits of buying a fresh hunk of Parmesan cheese and grating it oneself. As he did, he bounced a large chunk of wrapped cheese up and down in his left hand.
It's so much better. It makes my taste buds dance with delight. You should try it someday, dear boy. None of this pre-packaged stuff.
Huh. What great culinary advice. We arrived at the institute and made our way to the conference area. While he sat in the front row of the semicircle amphitheater among his grey-haired peers, I took a seat with the postgraduate students toward the back. I was pleased that Dr. Goody had invited me to accompany him to this weekly Clinical Pathological Conference, or CPC. I certainly was impressed by his diagnostic skills and by his eclectic general knowledge, be it classical music, literature, or, now, cheese. The routine of a CPC was that patients were seated in the well of the arena. Their history and physical findings were presented, followed by discussion and questions from the learned audience, directed at the presenting physician and the patient. On this occasion, the patient was an American college student who was wheeled into the well surrounded by a packed auditorium, seated upright on a gurney, gazing about, and facing a sea of inquisitive, murmuring faces. His neurologist stood slightly behind him and began to present his case in a monotonous on-and-on drone. His delivery was barely audible in the hushed, hot, and airless room. The patient slumped backwards onto the gurney, fast asleep. The drowsy audience jolted upright in their seats. Obvious narcolepsy. In narcolepsy, a patient has the propensity to fall asleep, particularly when startled suddenly. They rolled out the gurney as the audience settled down. And now came the dilemma. The college student who had his driving license revoked in the United States based on the neurological diagnosis of narcolepsy now sought their weighty opinions in his effort to overturn that decision. Debate came with great passion and at some length, but it was mostly lost on me. I was still disturbed by the crassness used to dramatize the diagnosis and wondered whether the patient had been forewarned. On the way back to UCH, Dr. Goody mentioned that this extreme form of showmanship was not unusual at Queen Square, and that this particular trick had been used several times before, perhaps justified because of its didactic value. I was not sure I agreed with his ethical point. Was I just young, uninitiated, and naive? I did not voice my opinion, grateful that he took me along, and mindful of his final evaluation of my activities on his firm.
On which side do you fall? Should the young man have his driving license reinstated?
That's a complex question. It depends on where the patient lives, where he will be driving, in a rural or city environment, who will be sitting with him, and if he is expected to encounter an intense stimulus like gunshots on a regular basis. It's like drivers with epilepsy or diabetes, wouldn't you say? He looked over, smiled, and nodded. Although I liked Dr. Goody's sophisticated teaching style, I found myself drawn more to Dr. Stern. I admired his composure, his mannerisms, and his approach to patients. He reminded me a touch of father. He was charming, and his patients seemed to worship him, hang on his every pedestrian word. I emulated him and sensed a hint of mutual liking. As our experience on the firm ended, Dr. Stern drove a second student and me in a new Ford station wagon to his consulting rooms in Harley Street, where we observed the approach and management of his private patients. His demeanor contrasted from that of bedside rounds at University Hospital. He was even more attentive, gracious, and flattering to the fee-paying ones. So, there was a thriving private practice within the national healthcare system, the NHS. Numerous physicians and surgeons had opted out of the NHS and worked wholly in the private sector. My rotations in neurology and chest services left me hungry for action. I found it in the casualty emergency department. Every free evening and on weekends after dinner, I showed up there. Shirley was the senior house officer in charge. She recognized that casualty was not a rotation for students. I had no real business there. But she tolerated my presence, maybe because she had been the previous student president of the Physiology Society before I appeared on the scene and took over her responsibilities. My regular appearance in her emergency department gradually made me an unquestioned fixture. I particularly liked examining surgically sick patients, primarily those complaining of abdominal pain. The head nurse, with Shirley's nod, allowed me to do this while awaiting the surgical house officer, who was always on his way down from the ward. The mysteries of the abdomen held greater enjoyment for me than watching a 12-inch black and white TV in a smoky, stuffy students' common room at the annex. I examined each patient's belly with great care, imagining with delight that I could feel the stomach, liver, spleen, colon, appendix, and perhaps even the ovaries. I considered the abdomen the most exciting domain in the body. It is a substantial, three-dimensional cavity, which I had learned about during my topography adventure with Victoria, extending from the level of the nipples to the anal sphincter. I soon became quite good at distinguishing diseases that masqueraded as abdominal pain from the conditions that might need urgent surgery. I learned that severe abdominal pain, lasting more than 4 hours, was most likely due to an emergency condition requiring an operation. I enjoyed examining acute abdomens and making the diagnosis of acute appendicitis a challenging diagnosis. I envied the house surgeon who got to operate on the patient and always sought confirmation as to what was found. In the near future, I would be the one wielding the knife. I could not wait. When Shirley could spare a few minutes from a busy workload, we compared my diagnosis and disposition plans. Initially, my evaluated decision assessment score was only around 20%, but then I had no authority to order the tests that might have refined my determinations. Shirley suggested that I acquire and read the definitive book on diagnosing and treating abdominal pain, The Early Diagnosis of the Acute Abdomen, by Zachary Cope. I did. Gradually, the averages of my decision score rose to 70% or so. When in doubt, an exploratory laparotomy was done, the penultimate test to figure out what was going on. Sometimes, in the absence of the busy surgical house staff, I got to help as first assistant. I was like a kid in a candy shop, touching every organ and wondering with reverence at their beautiful arrangement. On slow nights, I hung out with the nurses, listening to their general chatter. With the head nurse's permission, I sewed up lacerations. I debrided dead tissue and removed foreign bodies, thoroughly irrigated the wounds with saline to obtain fresh bleeding, then loosely wrapping them. The nurses taught me which wounds to sew shut and which to steri-strip to get the best cosmetic result. Once the head nurse told me to assist the new senior house officer, who had replaced Shirley. He was a young casualty officer who probably had graduated 3 years ahead of me, and was assigned to sew up a nasty head laceration on a drunk in minor theatre, room 3. I loved to improve my shaky sewing ability. I was sure he would supervise me closing the wound, and so I made my way to room 3. I opened the door, The patient lay snoring on the treatment table, covered from head to toe with sterile blue drapes. Behind the door, the senior house officer was passionately gorging himself on a nurse. She threw back her head and arched her body as he kissed his way down her shoulders. His hands caressed her under her disarrayed uniform, skirt hitched up to her waist, his hand fumbling with her pink panty. I gaped wordlessly, frozen in the doorway, too flabbergasted to speak. The senior house officer turned on me.
Get the fuck out of here, you sod!
Pushing him away, the nurse adjusted her clothes and scurried out of the room. The patient stirred under the drapes.
What? Me? Have you finished?
The lottery system of establishing how students chose their surgical firm once more worked in my favor. I got my first 3 months with Professor Pilcher. He primarily operated on lung cancer and diseases of the esophagus. My second 3 months would be learning general surgery while working with Mr. Hart, a senior consultant and surgeon. In the academic world, Professor Pilcher, the chair of surgery, was the top dog of the surgical pyramid. Mr. Hart, whose academic rank was reader, professor without a chair, was his number 2 man. The house officer, who had just finished medical school, sat at the bottom of the organizational chart. In between the top dogs and the house officer were a cadre of junior and senior house officers and registrars in training, and 6 medical students who were greatly valued because of their hunger to learn and willingness to work endless hours. The patients admitted to Professor Pilcher's surgical unit fell into 2 major groups. There were those with lung and esophageal cancer, who were primarily operated on by Professor Pilcher, and those with general surgical problems, hernias, varicose veins, and gastrointestinal disease, who fell under the purview of Mr. Hart. The house officer ran the service, often referred to as the firm. He admitted all the patients, clerked them, knew everything about them, prepared them for surgery, assisted in as many operations as possible, allocated medical students to assist the registrars, cared for the patients post-operatively, soothed the ego-driven issues that arose between registrars and nurses, and still somehow found time to eat and sleep. As with every medical student who rotated through every 3 months, I was invaluable to the house officer as a personal assistant, there to make his life easier, in the glorious, altruistic name of surgical education. The house officer and Professor Pilcher's firm appreciated me as one of the more dependable students. My craving to be in the theater and to assist on cases was his excuse not to have to assist, giving him time to be on the ward and attend to the many issues that cropped up. This left me little time to spend with Victoria, which worked out well because she was busy with her second-year book walk across the street at University College. We made do with quickies when our schedule allowed, working to keep our connection strong under the onslaught of educational requirements. The house officer assigned me first to clerk the professor's patients, on the understanding I would assist by relieving him during some of the professor's prolonged operations. I was thrilled at the prospect of scrubbing and being the second assistant, instead of observing outside the immediate field by standing on a stool behind other surgeons, barely seeing the action over their shoulders. When I finished clerking the professor's patients, I clerked the general surgical cases despite knowing they had already been worked up. I took my time to get a history and do a physical examination, focusing primarily on the system or organ attracting the knife. The more dependable and efficient I became, the more patients and tasks the house officer assigned to me. Professor Robin Pilcher was a tall, slender man with narrow lips, a thinning crop of white hair, and exuberant auburn fuzz growing from his ears. He was soft-spoken and warmed to people readily, everything a father-starved medical student could ask for in a resident. His demeanor depended on whether he was operating or doing rounds. In theater, he was a quiet leader. No chit-chat, no bantering. He started his cases at 9 a.m. This meant the knife went into the patient at 9. The surgical crew, including myself, turned up at 8 to get everything ready, although I mainly stood around observing. My love of the learning reminded me of a line in Mother's letter from Cairo to her parents in Hamburg, written on my birth.
He sees everything. Nothing escapes him. He hears everything. He smells everything. Loves every animal. In short, he loves life and the world.
I loved the world of the operating theatre. When he heard of my interest in becoming a surgeon, he invited me to scrub. On entering the room, the gowned and gloved professor moved into the sterilized surgical field. He operated with elan and assurance. He incised the chest wall from the armpit to the mid-abdominal line in one swift, clean, curvilinear cut. Leonardo da Vinci would have admired the artistry. The registrar assisted him to control the skin bleeders, remove a rib, and insert the spreader to part the surrounding ones. My first view of a lung shocked me. The deflated organ looked like a large, black, dried sponge. As a member of Roy's gang back at Burnage Preparatory when I was 9, I tried to join in and smoke woodbines in the back alleys. I'd done nothing but cough and retch with each puff and quickly stopped. As I took in the diseased lung before me, I felt relief that I'd been unable to master the act of smoking. Exploring the extent of the mass, Professor Pilcher looked up at the illuminated chest X-ray to correlate the findings as he began to cut out the cancer. His longtime scrub nurse stood by his side. She shared his view of the operative field. She anticipated his every move, gently slapping the specific instrument into his outstretched hand at just the right moment, the instant he needed it. He never had to ask for an instrument or draw his gaze from the depth of the wound. I watched, mesmerized, as he cut out a lobe of the lung that contained the cancer and oversewed the cuff of remaining normal tissue, tying off blood vessels and branches of the trachea with the help of his registrar. Such graceful movements. No wasted movement. Nothing superfluous. Perhaps one day I could be as dexterous and expert a surgeon. As the second assistant, I held a retractor in one hand to keep the surrounding tissues from collapsing into the wound and obscuring everyone's vision. In the other, I grasped a sucker, clearing pooled blood about the operative site or sucking up smoke from the bovie burn that coagulated the bleeders. With my attention fixed on the operative field, I guessed Professor Pilcher's next move to try to stay ahead of him, awkwardly disturbing their well-rehearsed routine. A team of nurses hovered in the background during the 3 to 4 hour operation. Each had a specific and essential task. Before we closed, we waited to hear the circulating nurse's loud pronouncement.
Sponge count is correct.
Only then did the scrub nurse hand us needle holders loaded with wire to approximate the ribs. Cotton thread was used to close the soft tissues of the chest wound. The scrub nurse placed the dressing. Professor Pilcher wrote a brief operative note, went for a cup of tea, and waited for his next patient, who was anesthetized in the anteroom. The turnover time between his cases was barely long enough for me to go and empty my bladder. Gradually, I became a familiar face at the operating table, rewarded by closing the wound with the scrub nurse, while the registrar attended to administrative issues. I found these long incisions tedious. They took forever to close. The boredom and my lack of patience precluded my becoming a thoracic surgeon. Closing long wounds did not suit my temperament. On rounds, Professor Pilcher always wore a starched, long white coat, which matched his pale complexion and white hair. His demeanor was different from his top-dog performance in theater, and he saw not only his own, but also every other patient in the surgical unit. Quite often, when the patient was a woman with major surgical issues and was upset or weepy, Professor Pilcher stopped rounds and perched on the edge of her bed. He gently grasped her hand or stroked her bare forearm, stroke, 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 to reassure her and engage her in hushed talk out of our earshot, but in sister's presence. This was the case especially when dealing with a diagnosis of breast cancer. He only rose when he had calmed and settled the patient's concerns. It reminded me of pictures in Sunday school in Germany of Jesus, laying his hands on the sick. The effect was similar, calming and reassuring, no matter how dire the message. I wondered if Professor Pilcher knew the 1880 poem by Spencer Michael Free, The Human Touch. A poster of it hung on the back of the toilet door in the annex. I read it every day while I sat there, weather permitting. The author was an American surgeon at Johns Hopkins. Watching my newfound hero, I found myself reciting it in my head. "'Tis the human touch in this world that counts." I adopted this hands-on therapy. During the initial week of my surgical rotation, I was assigned to a Mr. Winterberry, my first surgical patient at last. To get to know him, I first went to the nurse's station to pick up his chart. I found it unusually thick. Flicking through it, I read numerous consultations, from urologists, pulmonary physicians, cardiologists. Mr. Winterberry did not fit into the surgical mold. He had no distinct start and stop date to his presence on the surgical ward. The occasional surgeon's notes were brief and to the point. It requested that the patient be transferred from the surgical service to the radiation ward to complete his radiation therapy. The counter-argument by the radiology consultant was that he was a surgical patient by virtue of having had a biopsy of his rectal cancer. There seemed no resolution. The radiologist saw him as a surgical patient. The surgeon saw him as a radiology patient who should not occupy a surgical bed or merit daily visits on rounds. He was here and assigned to me, though, and so I determined to be ready to present him if Professor Pilcher stopped here on rounds. To break the ice, I asked him his occupation.
"I'm a stockbroker, a trader."
"Oh, I spend each Sunday afternoon reading Barron's, following a couple of pretend investments." He perked up.
"What sectors are you interested in?"
"Mining, primarily Rio Tinto zinc and De Beers. I'd love to someday make a few pennies on the side."
"Oh, I can help you."
As he raised himself onto his right elbow, the blanket slipped, revealing his pajama top.
"How much would you like to invest?"
"My £700 annual scholarship covered tuition, living expenses, books, and food. I had no spare cash. I tried to keep a sense of professional decorum. £5.
"Well, I can't charge you a commission. Are you willing to lose it all?"
Lose it? Was he kidding? I had put myself in an awkward position. £5 sterling represented my entire week's food allowance. I pictured myself going hungry, or inviting myself to Victoria's place or to other friends to get meals throughout the week. What would I tell them? I'd gambled away £5, not on the horses or the dogs, but on the stock exchange. They would laugh. Lose it? Of course not. But what I came out with was, sure, as if I lost £5 every day. To a surgeon, it would be small change.
"Come back tomorrow. I'll see what I can do."
The next afternoon, I reluctantly handed Mr. Winterberry a £5 note, wondering if I should ask for a receipt. He told me about several mining companies, none of which were familiar to me. Throughout his lively discourse, he took on facial expressions that probably approached his usual self, and gesticulated broadly.
"Do you know of Hampton Gold Mining Area? It's an Australian mining company prospecting for gold in the outback. Rumour has it that they've found uranium. They are listing at 1 shilling per share, currently selling at 3p. Your £5 would give you 80 shares. If the rumour is true, the shares will rise and you will make a tidy sum. If it's false, you'll probably lose your money."
I was following along until he mentioned the R word. Rumour? Did he say rumour? I deal with facts. He slipped my £5 note into his pajama breast pocket, and with that, I lost 1 week's subsistence. I had acted foolishly, pretending to be nonchalant about the whole matter to save face. I excused myself to join teaching rounds. When I returned several hours later to perform my clerking, his bed was empty. Thinking he'd gone to radiation therapy, I inquired at the nursing station. Discharged, was the reply. Discharged? I had trusted my gut feelings based on 5 minutes of interaction. I had not clerked him or retrieved my £5. A large manila envelope arrived 2 days later, containing a multicolored certificate with a wide border of fancy curlicues and embossed with Hampton Gold Mining Area Company. I was the owner of 80 shares. I hid the envelope among my books, feeling acutely embarrassed.
At the end of the various rotations, I began to realize that most students went through the numerous disciplines, rejecting the fields which least appealed to them. Medical school was the acquisition of knowledge that led, by the process of elimination, to a physician's career path. At the end of 4 years, most students knew what they liked and wanted to do the rest of their lives. I thought of internal medicine as a show and tell discipline. I, on the other hand, yearned for action. I knew I was meant for surgery. Not incidentally, Mr. Winterberry's advice eventually made it possible for me to get to America, but there would be more learning before that time came.
Thanks for listening to this project from 1C Productions, where thought-provoking media comes alive. Be sure to check out other 1C shows like Freevangelic, in which a married couple discuss their walk out of lifelong evangelicalism and into a new way of being. Their search for truth might open doors for you as well. Learn about Freevangelic and other 1C Productions podcasts at just1c.com. That's JUSTONEC.com.
You've been listening to Making the Cut from 1C Productions. Making the Cut was written, produced, and directed by Rebecca Seitz, based on Michael McGead's manuscript, Mastering the Knife. Noah James played Michael McGead. Other roles were brought to life by the voice talent of Gareth Rockcliffe, Jackie Weiner, David Marcus, Michelle Tischer, and Steve England. Audio engineering provided by Zisher LLC. Making the Cut theme music by Kyle J. Baker. Learn more at makingthecutpodcast.com.